Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled ImageTextures. There are two general types of textures in Blender, procedural textures and image textures. A procedural texture is an internal mathematically generated texture, and an image texture is an external image mapped to the faces of an object. To demonstrate image textures, I've placed in my Blender scene a plane, tube, cube, and sphere objects. I'm using the default camera and the default lamp, but I've added a second hemi-lamp at a very low energy level to fill in some of the shadows. I've also split my 3D viewports so that the rendering will appear in the right window. I'll select the plane object and click on the Material Context button, which displays the material editor. I'll click on the New button and name this material Plane Bricks. I'll then click on the Texture Context button, which displays the texture editor. I'll click on the New button. By default, Blender adds a procedural cloud texture named Texture. I'll click on the Type button and select Image or Movie as the texture type. If I had any previous images, I could select them by clicking on the ID Data drop-down box. As this is the first image used in this Blender scene, I'll click on the Open button. This displays Blender's file browser. To add an image, I first need to locate the image on my local computer. Here I will select the brickwall.jpg image located on my desktop. I'll press the Open button. The image texture is now displayed in the preview window of the texture editor, and the local path to the file is listed in the path box. I'll name this texture Brick Wall. Scrolling down to the Mapping panel, we see that the default mapping for this image will be generated by Blender using a flat projection. This means the image will be projected flat across the whole object faces. In the Influence panel, we see that the default influence is that the image will replace the diffuse color of the object. I'll press F12 and render the scene. Note the brick wall image texture is now displayed on the plane object. If we look at the Outliner panel, we see that the plane object has a mesh named Mesh, which has a material named Plane Bricks linked to it. The material has a texture named Brick Wall, which uses an image named Brick Wall JPEG. If we go to the Image Mapping panel, we see that the image has an X and Y repeat of 1, meaning that the image has no repeat. I'll increase the X repeat to 4 and the Y repeat to 4, and then render the scene. Now the image texture is repeated 4 times in the X direction and 4 times in the Y direction, making the bricks appear smaller. I will go up to the Image Sampling panel and checkmark the Flip XY Axis checkbox and re-render the scene. Now the brick pattern runs vertically rather than horizontally. I will uncheck the Flip XY Axis checkbox. Notice that the Image panel lists the path to the image file. In this case, the path is to my desktop. If I were to remove the image file from my desktop, this link would be broken and the image texture would not be displayed. Saving this Blender file will only save the path information and not the image file itself. To save the image file with the Blender file, we have to pack the image. To do this, I'll go to the UV image editor, which I have already set up at the right side of my 3D viewport. Under the Browse ID Data drop-down box, I'll select the brickwall.jpg image. This will display the image file in the UV editor. I'll then click on the Image button in the UV image editor header and select Pack. This will package the image file with the blend file. When the blend file is saved, the brickwall.jpg image will be saved inside of the blend file, independent of the original path. I'll reselect the render result for the UV image editor display, and I'll re-render the scene. I'll select the sphere object, and in the material editor, I will add a new material and name it Globe. I'll then go to the texture editor and add a new texture. I'll select Image or Movie as the type. I'll click on the Open button and select the earthmap.jpg image located on my desktop, and then click on Open. Notice the path to the file listed in the path box, and also notice the pixel size of the image displayed below the path box. I'll scroll down to the Mapping panel and select Sphere as the mapping projection. I'll then render the scene. The earthmap.jpg image texture is now mapped to the sphere object. I'll name this texture EarthMap. I'll now select the tube object. In the material editor, I will add a new material and name it Marble. I'll then go to the texture editor and add a new texture. I'll select Image or Movie as the type. I will click on the Open button and select the Arabesque JPEG image located on my desktop, and then click on Open. In the Mapping panel, I'll select Tube as the mapping projection. In the Image Mapping panel, I'll set the repeat to x equals 2 and y equals 2. I'll then render the scene. The marble image texture is now mapped to the tube object. I will name this texture Fire Marble. I'll next select the cube object. In the material editor, I will add a new material and name it Block Images. I'll then go to the texture editor and add a new texture. I'll select Image or Movie as the type. I'll click on the Open button and select the Neal.png image located on my desktop, and then click on Open. I'll scroll down to the Mapping panel and select Cube as the mapping projection. I'll then render the scene. Notice that the image is projected from 6 sides, with each face of the cube receiving a projected image mapping. Scrolling down to the Mapping panel, we see that there is a set of controls for size. By default, this is set to x, y, and z equals 1. I'll change the x and y settings to 0.5. The z setting on a 2D image really has no effect. With the size set to 1/2, I'll render the scene. In effect, we have zoomed into the image by decreasing the mapping size by 1/2. We can offset the image mapping by adjusting the x and y offsets in the Mapping panel. Here I will offset the y mapping to a positive 0.3 blender units, and then render the scene. The image texture is now offset. If we look at the Influence panel, we see that the image texture is replacing the diffuse color because the diffuse color box is checked by default, and the influence is set to full or 1. I'll go back to the material editor and set the diffuse color to blue. I'll then go back to the texture editor, and in the Influence panel, I'll reduce the diffuse influence to 0.5. Now I'll render the scene. Now because the image texture has only a 0.5 influence on the diffuse color, some of the underlying blue color is now also rendered. If I uncheck the diffuse color box and render the scene, the image texture has no effect on the rendering. I'll recheck the diffuse color box and reset the influence to full. Note that by default, the type of influence blend is set to mix. That is, the texture is mixed with the underlying diffuse color to whatever extent indicated by the influence slider. Since the influence slider is at full, or 1, the underlying diffuse color is completely rendered over by the image texture. We can change the blend from mix to any number of different blend types by clicking on the blend drop-down box. Here I will use the image texture to lighten the underlying diffuse color. Here it is used to darken the underlying diffuse color. Here the image texture will affect the hue of the diffuse color. Here the image texture will affect the saturation of the diffuse color. I will return the type to mix and re-render. It is also possible to reverse any texture effect by checkmarking the negative button, which inverts the value of the texture. Using image textures, especially in combination with the diffuse and specular shaders, ramps, transparency, and mirror controls, offers a limitless number of surface treatments. Now, as we will see in later video tutorials, it's also possible to use image textures to influence a wide variety of Blender controls.